Welcome to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's meeting of its Community Bank Advisory Council, or CBAC. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is an independent federal agency whose mission is to help consumer finance markets work by making rules more effective, by consistently and fairly enforcing those rules, and by empowering consumers to take more control over their economic lives. My name is Delicia Hand, and I'm Staff Director for the Advisory Board and Council's Office in the Division of External Affairs at the CFPB. Today's meeting is being held at the CFPB's headquarters in Washington, D.C., and this is the CBAC's second meeting of the year. As always, we have a packed schedule. Today's meeting is being live streamed on consumerfinance.gov, and a recording will be made available on the CFPB's website. You can also follow CFPB on Twitter and Facebook. Let me spend a few minutes telling you what you can expect at today's meeting. First, I'll introduce the Bureau's CBAC members. Then, the CFPB's Director, Richard Cordray, will provide opening remarks. Following the Director's remarks, the CBAC Chair, David Reiling, will conduct the meeting. Chair Reiling will then introduce Sunaina Lahill and Cassandra McConnell-Tatum, subject matter experts with the Bureau's Office of Financial Education. The two will lead a discussion about youth financial capability. Following the discussion, the CBAC will hear from Kristen McPartlin and John McNamara, subject matter experts within the Bureau's Research, Markets, and Regulations Division. The two will lead a discussion about debt collection. The meeting will then adjourn at approximately 5 p.m. The Bureau established a Community Bank Advisory Council to include representatives of community banks from across the country. The CBAC is charged with providing substantive information, analysis, operational expertise, knowledge of their communities, and feedback to inform the Bureau's work. Today's public meeting and discussion is in support of this important responsibility. As a reminder, the views of the CBAC members are their views. They are greatly appreciated and welcome, yet they do not represent the views of the CFPB. So let's get started with an introduction of our CBAC members. The chair is David Reiling. David is CEO of Sunrise Banks in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The vice chair is Angela Belke. Angela is Vice President, Mortgage Department Manager of American Bank and Trust in Huron, South Dakota. Jonathan Allen is Chief Compliance Officer of Bank of American Fork in American Fork, Utah. Melissa Ballard is Vice President and Director of First Iowa State Bank in Albia, Iowa. Menzo Case is President and CEO of Generations Bank in Seneca Falls, New York. Kathleen Cook is President and CEO of the Village Bank in St. Libery, Illinois. Julia DeBerry is Senior Vice President, Risk Management and Internal Audit at Bath Savings Institution in Bath, Maine. Linda Ferry is Vice President of CRA and Fair Lending Officer at Citywide Bank in Denver, Colorado. Jack Hopkins is President and CEO of Core Trust Bank in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Brenda Hughes is Senior Vice President, Director of Mortgage and Retail Lending at First Federal Savings Bank in Twin Falls, Idaho. Dion Kidd Johnson is President, COO, and CRO at Western Bank in Alamogordo, New Mexico. Ricky Leal is Community Lender and Senior Vice President of First Community Bank in Harlingen, Texas. Kara Quick is Vice President for Compliance of First Hope Bank in Hope, New Jersey. Cal Ratcliffe is Senior Vice President and Chief Compliance Officer at Bank of North Carolina in High Point, North Carolina. Trent Sorby is President of Central Payments Division at Central Bank of Kansas City in Kansas City, Missouri. Thomas Spitz is the Chief Executive Officer of Settlers Bank in Windsor, Wisconsin. Steve Swantek is the Chairman, President, and CEO of Gate City Bank in Fargo, North Dakota. Samuel Vallandingham is President and CEO of the First State Bank in Barboursville, West Virginia. I'm now pleased to introduce Richard Cordray. Prior to his current role as the CFPB's first director, he led the CFPB's enforcement office. Before that, he served on the front lines of consumer protection as Ohio's Attorney General. In this role, he recovered more than $2 billion for Ohio's retirees, investors, and business owners, and took major steps to help protect its consumers from fraudulent foreclosures and financial predators. Before serving as Attorney General, he also served as Ohio State Representative, Ohio Treasurer, and Franklin County Treasurer. Director Cordray.
Thank you, Delicia, and welcome everyone to this public session of the Community Bank Advisory Council. Let me get my microphone situated. Good. Today we'll talk about promoting financial education among consumers, especially young people, and about our new proposed rule on debt collection. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and concerns as we discuss these and other issues. I especially want to welcome our newest members, joining us for the first time since their appointment in August. Thank you, David Reiling, for taking the chair, and Angela Belke for serving as vice chair. Together, we've had good discussion and sharing of perspectives, and I look forward to what we can accomplish together today and in the future. As the Bureau's director, I've witnessed the vital role community banks play in the lives of the consumers and neighborhoods you serve. You are serious about the responsibilities you feel to your customers and your communities. You're very engaged in financial education programs. Because you're on the front lines of these issues, we want to hear from you. In fact, we formed this council to learn more about how community banks operate day to day and to hear about the challenges you're facing. This information helps us do our work better, and no doubt the same will be true of our discussions today. Financial education is an issue of great importance to the Consumer Bureau. Right now, we're just completing what we have called our Back to School Month. Millions of young people, including my own high school-age twins, have been settling into new class schedules, homework, and after-school activities. I can tell you they are insanely busy. Others who recently finished school have begun for the first time to navigate a financial marketplace that calls on them to make increasingly complex decisions. From your daily experiences with these customers, you know the difficulties faced by those who lack a solid foundation of financial know-how and decision-making skills. As a country, we need to be frank about how far we've fallen short of the mark here. We simply have not made enough effort in our schools to succeed in the important task of teaching our young people how to handle their personal finances. Studies show that nearly 90% of parents and teachers believe financial education should be taught in schools, but only 17 states require high school students to take a personal finance course in order to graduate. A recent study found that students who had taken a personal finance course had better credit scores and less chance of delinquency later on, as compared to students from states with less emphasis on financial education. Developing financial capability in young people is not simply a matter of talking dollars and cents. A few weeks ago, we released a report entitled Building Blocks to Help Youth Achieve Financial Capability. We're going to talk more about that today. The report presents a new evidence-based developmental framework and recommendations to help consumers build financial capability. These building blocks begin in early childhood with a focus on promoting executive function, which is the sense of self-control that supports future orientation, perseverance, and planning abilities. Consumers will later rely on these abilities to set financial goals, save for the future, and stick to a budget. During the preteen years, the next building block is to help children begin to develop financial habits and norms. At this stage, children begin to gain a sense of what is normal or appropriate in terms of spending, saving, or other financial matters. These habits and norms will shape decisional shortcuts that they will go on to use to make routine financial choices. Finally, as students approach maturity during their teen years, they begin to have more direct experiences with the financial world. That may involve working at their first job or buying a car. These experiences provide increased opportunities to improve their financial knowledge and decision-making skills. During this developmental stage, financial education programs should help teens improve their financial knowledge and analytical skills. Above all, our report confirms that financial capability is not just about book learning and mastering financial information, but also requires a broader set of attributes and abilities that are developed throughout childhood and youth. Along with the report, we released a personal finance pedagogy, which is a resource to help educators teach financial lessons that improve financial capability. A core element is a teaching tool called the Personal Finance Wheel. It points teachers to techniques and strategies that will help young people gain the necessary skills at different stages in their development. This is the same framework that underpins our Money as You Grow webpage we introduced in March, which has resources to aid parents and caregivers when they talk to their children about financial matters. Money as You Grow has activities for each age group, from children as young as 3 years old to teenagers and young adults. They include interactive ways to help young people develop the money skills and habits they need for a better financial future. Our latest chapter of this initiative is our book club, a collection of 9 books aimed at children ages 4 to 10. We plan to add a new book each month that parents and caregivers can read with their children and learn in a creative and positive way about money management. They can talk about money concepts through the stories and characters they find in these books. All of them are popular children's books, and all of them are easily accessible in libraries, at bookstores, and online. Our book club selections reflect ideas that are important to both childhood development and building financial capability. For example, Alexander, who used to be rich last Sunday, that's the title of it, tells how he makes mistakes with his money and learns the importance of self-control to save up to buy what he really wants. Discussion guides for each of the 9 books are free and can be downloaded from the website. They offer guidance about what questions to ask and what activities can be used to reinforce the lessons learned about financial capability. And we hope that everybody, including members of our advisory council and all of their institutions, and all of you watching this live stream today, will make use of our Money as You Grow book club. But financial education involves more than just working with our young people. It also means reaching out to people at work and in their communities with the information and support they need, when they need it, in ways that they can understand and act on. In this vein, I applaud the efforts of community banks to promote financial capability throughout the community. Many of you offer instruction, both in the schools and in the community, on subjects such as budgeting, savings, lending, building credit, and preventing fraud. Some of you engage in outreach in languages other than English to reach parts of the community that might otherwise be shut out from these important programs and information. We want to learn more about how these efforts and many others are helping to boost America's financial IQ. One way we try to assess these issues is through the National Financial Capability Study, which is an annual survey of the American people's financial wherewithal. The Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, known as FINRA, conducts this study as a snapshot of the obstacles and opportunities consumers face in their daily financial lives. This year's edition has some good news. 7 years after the first FINRA study was conducted, Americans on average report less financial stress and more satisfaction with their financial condition. Consumers are feeling better able to absorb an unexpected financial shock, although almost half still report some trouble in covering expenses and paying bills. For the first time since its initial publication in 2009, nearly half of Americans have an emergency fund set aside to cover 3 months of expenses. And the number of people who said they're highly satisfied with their financial condition has roughly doubled since 2009 and now stands at more than 30%. That is encouraging news, but the results also reveal that large swaths of our society continue to face financial difficulties. More than half said they do not have 3 months of emergency savings, and more than a third said they could not cover an unexpected expense of $2,000. People in certain groups reported that their financial conditions are especially fragile. These include young people, women, African Americans, and Hispanics. If we're going to increase overall financial capability and well-being among all Americans, we all need to play a part. As we continue to move beyond the financial crisis, we need to empower people to take more control over their economic lives. As more people develop greater financial capability, our economy will gain a stronger and more enduring foundation that benefits us all. So we would like your input on all of these issues. Tell us how we can work more effectively with community banks to foster financial capability in our young people. Help us get the word out through your banks and your networks, and help us find ways to get your banks and other community banks to employ our financial educational resources. We see community banks like libraries, with whom we are working extensively, as natural partners in this work. We should try harder to make progress together to help people improve this critical aspect of their lives. We look forward to doing that with you. The other topic we want to discuss today reflects the kinds of problems that arise when consumers lack financial capability and are unable effectively to manage the ways and means of their lives. That topic is the Consumer Bureau's new proposal to overhaul the debt collection market. The main law that governs debt collectors and protects consumers is the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, which was enacted in 1977. That was almost 40 years ago. No agency has ever had the ability to update the law by issuing supporting regulations until now. We now have the authority and the responsibility to do so, and that is the task at hand. In July, we announced that we have a proposal under consideration to update federal standards on debt collection. It takes into account rapid changes in technology and would help clear up decades of conflicting court rulings. Under our proposal, debt collectors would need to have more and more reliable information about the debt before they collect. They would have to limit their attempts to make contact, clearly disclose details about the debt, and make it easier to dispute the debt. When responding to disputes, they would not be able to pursue collection without sufficient evidence. These conditions and restrictions would apply as well if the debt is sold or transferred. Our goal is to bring more accuracy and accountability to a market that desperately needs it. We are in the early stages of weighing different aspects of this proposal and hearing comments, so this is a good time to be having this conversation. Debt collection generates more complaints to the Consumer Bureau than any other financial product or service. This has been true at all levels of government, federal as well as state, around the country since well before we came along. We've heard complaints about collectors seeking to collect debt from the wrong consumer for the wrong amount, or debt that could not legally be enforced. When consumers are contacted by collectors for debt they do not recognize, they often do not know where to turn. Some feel pressure to resolve the debt without a clear understanding of their rights. Some pay a debt they think is wrong just to get the collector off their back. Other times, consumers spend significant time and money trying to dispute the debt, often in the face of unnecessary obstacles, simply because they've not carried all their personal records with them through all the years of their lives. According to the preliminary results of a survey we conducted, about 1 of 3 consumers has been contacted by a creditor or collector trying to collect a debt within the past year. That is some 70 million consumers. Many reported they were being pursued on multiple debts, between 2 and 4 debts for most of these consumers. And fully 1/3 of the consumers contacted about a debt in the last year said they believed the collector was trying to collect the wrong amount. Debt collection is a multi-billion-dollar industry with more than 6,000 debt collection firms in the United States. Some are given inaccurate or incomplete information when they are hired or when they purchase debt to collect. They may also add errors of their own through sloppy procedures that compound the harm to consumers. All of this generates problems and disputes, and it can drive up costs to collectors, which hurts the industry as a whole. When an account is sold or moved, the information that transfers may benefit only the collector, not the consumer, which creates still more problems. The proposal we have under consideration right now would overhaul the entire process from the moment third-party collectors first receive their debt portfolios to their very last efforts to collect. The proposal also covers many debt buyers, and as part of our work in this area, we plan to address issues with first-party debt creditors on a separate track. We held a field hearing on these issues in Sacramento, California recently, and we convened a small business review panel to gather feedback. We will continue to seek counsel from consumer groups, the public, industry, and other stakeholders as we proceed with the rulemaking process. This is not our first foray into the debt collection marketplace. In October of 2012, we issued a rule establishing our supervisory authority over non-bank debt collectors with more than $10 million annually in consumer debt collection receipts. This covers some 175 debt collectors, accounting for more than 60% of this market, and it was the first time the federal government had ever asserted supervisory authority over debt collectors. We also have enforcement authority, which we share with the Federal Trade Commission and state attorneys general, and we consistently work together in a group effort to police unlawful practices in this industry. Both on our own and with these partners, we've ordered companies to halt violations of federal law and made them refund hundreds of millions of dollars they had unlawfully collected from consumers. All of that experience creates a strong foundation for us now to proceed with our rulemaking to reform the debt collection market. Debt can overwhelm people and leave them feeling helpless and powerless as they try to fend off harassing debt collectors. By cleaning up the integrity of this process, we can resolve many issues before they become problems. And with better financial education for our young people, we can head off some of these issues in the first place by putting them on a sure path toward financial security. So thank you all, and I look forward to our discussion today. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Director Cordray and Alicia. Welcome to the second meeting of 2016 of the CFPB's Community Bank Advisory Council. My name is David Reiling. I chair the CFPB's Community Bank Advisory Council. I'd like to welcome members of the public as well as new and returning members of the Advisory Council. The CFPB organized this council in 2012 as a means to hear regularly from community banks from all over the country. Since I've been a part of the council, I've observed and participated in what I believe to be a productive exercise. This advisory council has provided an opportunity for community banks to raise emerging issues facing them and share their input and perspectives on the Bureau's work to protect consumers. During this afternoon's meeting, we will hear from council members on two issues: approaches for helping young people achieve their financial capability, and also council members will learn about the Bureau's recent debt collection proposal to provide feedback. First, we will hear from the CFPB staff, Cassandra McConnell-Tatum and Suswena Lehil, who will serve as Bureau experts on financial education. Then we will shift over to a discussion with the council members to gain their perspectives on what are some of the key issues for community banks and where the CFPB ought to be focusing its attention in this space. During that time, I'll ask council members to share their thoughts and opinions, as well as ask questions on the important topics. I'd like to now invite Cassandra McConnell-Tatum, Deputy Assistant Director for the Office of Financial Education, and Suswena Lehil, K-12 Senior Policy and Innovation Analyst in the Office of Financial Education, to share with us the Bureau's recent activity and research in youth financial literacy and capability. Cassandra, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so very much, David. Welcome, everyone from the commissions, and we're very happy to be here today. I'm going to use most of our time to let my colleague Suswena Lehil really talk about the research that we have completed and what we have learned about how children learn around financial education. And I look forward to engaging in a conversation with you after her presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Suswena Lehil, and I work in the Bureau's Office of Financial Education, and I work on our children and youth portfolio. And I think because this is our really first time speaking to this group about our youth work, my presentation will provide a quick overview of what we're doing in the youth space. And then I will talk about some research insights that we've gained and have published in a report that we published earlier this month called Building Blocks to Help Youth Achieve Financial Capability. So while we have a number of tools and resources available, most of my presentation will be very focused on this new research that we've done. And part of the reason why we're focusing on this topic is I would love to hear sort of your thoughts about how we can take this research, these insights, and connect it to the work that community banks are doing. So, next slide. So just to give you sort of an overview of our youth financial education work, and when I say youth, I mean children and youth. We really have sort of the goal of our work here is to support and empower youth stakeholders to expand and improve access to financial education. We recognize that as a federal agency, we can't reach all children and youth in this country, and that intermediaries, community organizations, and financial institutions, and a variety of other stakeholders are really critical to reaching and serving youth. We think that by pursuing this goal, children and youth in our country will have the opportunities to become financially capable adults. The way we do this work is really focused on working with sort of three different stakeholder groups. We work with and support education and community leaders who are working to increase financial education opportunities for children and youth in their communities. We also work to support practitioners, whether that be teachers, educators, after-school program providers. We seek to develop tools and resources that they can use to support financial capability. And we also engage and empower parents and caregivers, recognizing the important role that they have on their children's financial development. We also have a number of tools and resources to reach them, and I think the director talked about some of them in his remarks. So now turning over to some of the research that we've done, some of you might have heard about the fact that CFPB has been doing research on financial well-being, particularly financial well-being for adults. And in the past couple of years, the CFPB has created the first ever consumer-driven definition of financial well-being. As well, we've developed a measurement scale for measuring financial well-being over time. And so the reason I'm talking about this work is because this really sort of sparked the question that we ended up doing research on that I will be talking about. So the financial well-being definition, which you can see on the slides, can be really summed up into 4 pieces. One is having control over day-to-day and month-to-month finances. 2 is having the capacity to absorb a financial shock. 3 is having the financial freedom to make choices that allow people to enjoy life, and being on track to meet your financial goals. So when we think about financial well-being for adults, and in some ways the end goal of financial capability efforts is financial well-being. And so in addition to sort of this definition, we also looked at what are the sort of the drivers that help people to have more or less of financial well-being. And so when we looked at that research, we really wanted to know how much of that is developed and honed in childhood and in youth, and how do they develop so that we can embed that or provide that to those who are developing programs and educational resources. And so we really commissioned research to asking this question: how and when do the foundations of financial capability develop? And so the lessons learned from that research is in the building blocks research, and I will talk about 2 components of that report today. So I'll talk about the foundations of financial capability, what they are, and really quickly, how they develop, as well as the recommendations or strategies that we think, given what we know about this developmental framework, how can we implement that into this work, whether it be, policymakers or program leaders. So before I go into all of the specifics of what we learned, I do want to really quickly talk about sort of the methodology behind the research. So the developmental framework that I will talk about, in developing that, there were sort of 3 stages of investigation. An analysis of the coded interview transcripts from CFPB's previous adult financial well-being research, which I quickly talked about earlier. And the reason we looked at that is we wanted to know what did adults say about identities or values that they learned early on in life. So what are the sort of connections to identities and values that they developed earlier? The second was extensive review of published research. So we did this to uncover what is known and not yet understood in published academic research. And we looked at a variety of disciplines. So we looked at the fields of consumer science, developmental psychology, and education. And the third piece is we consulted with national experts. And these experts represented a variety of disciplines. And the goal here was to understand, gain additional insights about what they know that may not yet be reflected in the academic literature. And so we talked to experts in child and adolescent development, financial capability, and consumer sciences, to name a few. So in the next slide, I will show you, the 3 building blocks of financial capability, and then talk about when and how they develop. Okay, this is jumping ahead. There we go. Okay, so there are 3 building blocks to financial capability, and we really think these are the foundations of financial capability, that in order to be able to achieve the financial well-being in adulthood, these are the things that children and youth really need the opportunities to develop. And so the first is executive function. The second is financial habits and norms. And the third is financial knowledge and decision making. And for each of these building blocks, we've identified what it is, what it supports in adulthood, and examples of it in the financial context. So executive function is a set of cognitive processes that we use to plan, focus our attention, remember information, and juggle multiple tasks successfully. And so an example of this in the financial realm might be if you are somebody who is, tends to set goals and create a budget toward setting that goal, you have future orientation, and that is a component of executive function. Similarly, if you are, on track to meet your goal and you're sticking to your budget, you probably have good sort of self-regulation, which is another component of financial executive function. The second is financial habits and norms, and this really refers to the values, norms, standards, and routine practices that we have, and much of it really is developed early on and shaped by what we see our peers, the parents, the adults around us doing. And the third is financial knowledge and decision-making skills. And I think this is probably the most familiar to those who've worked on or have been involved in financial education. This is really referring to the familiarity with financial facts and concepts and the ability to do things like financial research and to do purposeful financial research and intentional financial decisions. So those are the foundations of financial capability, the what it is. In the next slide, you'll see sort of how they develop. So what we did is we took the building blocks and we mapped it across developmental stages. And there are 3 developmental stages that are fairly broad, in part because this is really built on research from education and child psychology. If it were up to me, I would have broken it up further, but this is really what the experts tell us are the best ways to think about it. So when you're looking at the slide, the arrows that point downward what it's showing is that the development of these building blocks is a continuous process, and they often overlap. So they don't necessarily start and stop within a given developmental stage. And the check marks with the circle represent important windows of opportunity when youth typically and are most readily able to learn that particular building block. So it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be supporting, executive function in middle childhood. It just means that in early childhood, that's really the critical piece because that's what's developing most rapidly. And similarly with financial habits and norms, as you can see, it develops earlier in early childhood, but what's really happening primarily in middle childhood is the development of financial habits and norms. And lastly, the financial knowledge and decision makings. So that piece is really relevant in adolescents in that 13 to 21 age range because that is when the youth tend to be most receptive to that type of information, in part because they are gaining more access to the financial world or maybe making more financial decisions and choices on their own. So this information becomes more relevant to them. But some of that more basic sort of versions of that could be supported earlier. So again, these are just ideal touch points that where we think it's most important to focus. So one thing that I do want to point out is, this is sort of a developmental framework, which means this is what research suggests happens in a typical setting. So there, obviously will be individual differences and, a variety of environmental factors can affect, individual, where they might be in the developmental model. And one thing that I want to underscore here is given that the development starts really early, as early as 3, and continues on to 21, one of the sort of takeaways for us here has been that this is a supporting financial capability. Really, it takes a village. It requires a number of stakeholders. It's not just the teachers, it's not just the parents, but also after-school programs and employment programs and policymakers and financial institutions. There's really a role for everyone to play. There we go. Okay, so now that you've seen the developmental framework, I want to talk a little bit about the so what. So what do we do with this information and how can you implement this into the work? And so what we did was we developed 4 recommendations based on what we think is promising and also based on the developmental framework. And so the 4 recommendations are that in early childhood, it's really critical that we focus on developing their executive functioning skills, and some of this can be done in a financial context in a way that's age appropriate. And that's a newer area that we would love to see more exploration of. The second is that given sort of the recognizing the important role of parents and caregivers, there really is an opportunity to more actively engage them in the financial education and capability initiatives. And particularly, they play a really critical role in the development of the financial habits and norms. And so they have an instrumental role there in particular. And then the third recommendation is provide children and youth with experiential learning opportunities. This one is, most of this is not new, but this one in particular is not new. I think this research just reinforced to us how important it is for financial education that is combined with experiential learning opportunities. So, combining classroom education with access to a bank account or a savings product or simulations that allow young people to make decisions, see the outcomes of those decisions in a sort of a safe context, and then reflect and learn from those experiences. And then the fourth is teaching financial research skills. This one in particular, rose to the top because of the reality that financial education can't prepare young people for every financial encounter or decision that they will make in their life, but arming them with sort of the research abilities, the critical thinking skills, the ability to do comparison shopping is really going to be helpful to them for the rest of their lives. So that's the overview of the recommendations. I'll talk a little bit about each one of them. The focusing on executive function, I think this is it's critical for financial well-being because so much of this is, the future orientation, being able to stick to a plan, having sort of the goal-setting ability, and executive function training in a financial context can be done, and we'd love to see more of this being explored, but examples might be imaginary play or play-based learning activities where kids get to set goals and manage the resources. So it doesn't necessarily have to be money. It can be managing time or other more tangible things that they're engaging with. In the next slide is the second recommendation around financial socialization. As I mentioned before, financial socialization is this ongoing process that's occurring, and this really supports the financial habits and norms and the values that they develop. So whether or not parents or caregivers are aware, children and youth, their children are observing and learning from the sort of the behavior that they're modeling. And so given that that's already happening, the importance for engaging parents and caregivers in this context is particularly exciting. And it can be done in a modeled, where they're doing, where they sort of are transparent about perhaps when they're paying bills saying, here's sort of how I go about paying my bill and here's how I go about remembering to do it every month. Or, here's what our family budget looks like, So it can be done in that context. And you can also have more sort of explicit sort of conversations. And then the third recommendation is around teaching youth financial experiential learning. This experiential learning opportunities support financial capability by giving children and youth the opportunity to take initiative, make decisions, experience the outcome of those decisions, of course, in a safe environment, and then encouraging them to reflect so that they're able to learn from that experience, and then hopefully repeat that so that they're able to develop sort of habits and behaviors. And explicit instruction in personal finance, really, our research is showing that it really should be complemented with experiential learning, whether that's a simulation, school bank programs, child savings, or employment programs when they're getting a first paycheck, combining that with financial education. And then financial research skills. Most major, as I mentioned earlier, most major financial decisions that adults make, require us to gather information, use that information, consider trade-offs, and then figure out what's the right choice for us. And helping young people to develop these research skills early on can really arm them so that they can make the choices that support their life goals. Okay, so bringing it all together, I think just, this research is really exciting, at least I think in the financial capability field, because largely there's often this question of what do you teach and what's appropriate to teach in what sort of developmental stage or age group. And this really elucidates some of those questions and also suggests that for those of us thinking about financial education for children and youth, that we really should be looking at it more broadly. Yes, financial facts and information is really important and critical, but there are also these other capabilities that are developing earlier on in their lives that can engage a variety of people around them, right? Parents and caregivers and teachers. And so just underscores the importance of thinking about this more broadly to include things like executive function and financial habits and norms. And just given the many dimensions to this, it really also underscores for us the importance of engaging a variety of stakeholders, not just the teachers and the parents, but also the role of policymakers and financial institutions and a variety of others working in this area. So in the next slide, I'm going to really quickly go over just some of the tools and resources we've developed to help financial educators and parents and caregivers to implement some of the things that we've learned in this research. And so Money as You Grow is one of the resources. I won't go into it too much, but it's basically an online resource that's already available to parents and caregivers. It helps parents with activities, games, and discussion guides that they can use in things that they may already be doing with their children. And this is a resource that was donated to us by Beth Kobliner of the President's Advisory Council on Financial Capability. And what we did is we took that really wonderful resource and updated it and made sure it was aligned to the developmental sort of framework that I just described. In addition to that, we just recently this month launched the Money as You Grow book club. That is another resource that really aligns what we're learning in this research. And a resource for parents and caregivers to read books with their children and have conversations about resource management and financial issues. And it comes with a discussion guide, and there's also a guide for those who may want to set up a book club in their library or their community. And then the third resource is the personal finance pedagogy. This is a guide for teachers when they're teaching financial education. This resource helps them to navigate, given the three building blocks, what are the teaching techniques and learning strategies that are aligned with them, and what types of activities might be more appropriate for a given sort of type of lesson. So those are just some of the resources that we are providing around the building blocks research, and welcome your thoughts about what else, opportunities there might be for embedding this in other areas. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. At this point in time, we'll open it up to the council members and get your feedback and thoughts. Go ahead, Sam.
We have long participated in the Money Smart program and been involved with our local school system. We have, K through 12 kids come to the bank and introduce them to different functionality at the bank, talk about what we do every day. And we found that to be very positive and reinforcing. I applaud your efforts. I think to the extent that we can incorporate those and make those available to both educators and parents, I think it would be a benefit because we find them to be useful and we find it to be fun in all actuality. I mean, it's really enjoyable to see a group of third grade kids come into the bank, and of course what they want to see is where's the money stored, but you have a lot more conversations, and they are interested and they do want to know.
Definitely. Kathleen.
We have long had a program at our bank. We're in a very small town, and we still have our grade school. And we have banking day once a month, and one of my loan officers, or my cashier actually, goes to the bank and works with the parents, sends home documentation, and we actually open up accounts, savings accounts only, for these children who want to, and then and the parents are involved. We are involved with the parents. And then once a month, they actually, the cashier will go down there and they can make deposits to their savings account. And that we work well with the school. They announce it, it's Banker Tim Day, and, the kids can all come and make their deposits. And we've had success with it, and we have also brought them all into the bank to show them this is the next step of what happens with your money, with the deposit. And I wish we had more parents want to do this with their children, but we keep trying to promote it, and we do get more all the time. And as far as your research goes, I think it's very, very important that the education starts at this level, so that maybe by the time they get to college, they will certainly understand the student loan system better than they do today. I had student loan issues with my children, and now I'm going through the same thing with my grandchildren, and quite frankly, it hasn't changed. There is no more, and I'm a banker, and even in my own family, I find this a problem. So I think this is great that you're doing this, and hopefully it'll benefit the students and the parents down the road.
I wanted to mention that we work with junior achievement in our schools, and they have some great resources. And we start with, K through 12, and it's a progression. And we work with all these different levels of grades. And also, we work specifically, I target the underserved communities. So I'm looking at those schools with student populations that are eligible for free or reduced lunches, over 50%. And so they're always very excited about the program. Our bank has used Money Smart, and I work with several nonprofits, and they're reaching out and asking for financial education for themselves and for their children. So we have worked with these nonprofits for the community. They have a pulse on the community. They invite the community to come in. We provide the financial education, and also sometimes I will reach out to specific nonprofits and ask, is this something we can provide for you, for your children, or for you as adults? And I see this as a great resource because this will just work hand in hand with what we're already doing. And we can have them go online and work with these resources. So I applaud you for this. I appreciate it. And so does our communities.
Please, go ahead, Dion.
I just really wanted to let you know, I like the idea a whole lot of the Money As You Grow book club. I know with a granddaughter that's now 4 years old, my daughter started taking a book with her every night to read to her, and they still do that. Mm-hmm. So if we could somehow break in, and I think you said 3 years is where this all starts, if we could break in and start before they get into school, somehow banks, maybe we could all figure out how to get these books to parents in doctor's offices or something and sign them up where we provide the books as a gift to the kids, and the guides are free to download and help the parents learn to teach their kids about money. I think this is something that's been needed for many, many years. I, for one, graduated high school, and my first bank had to teach me how to balance my checkbook. So like she said down there, it hasn't changed. So I love this idea of starting way earlier and not depending upon the role model of the parent now to guide the child's development, but to get the teachers involved, the community involved, and start with something as simple as reading a book to them at night. Mm-hmm. I really commend you. This is a great program.
Great, thank you.
Go ahead, Angela.
Susanna, I just am curious within the research that you found, what age group or where did you find that it comes into a play where we need to start teaching them mobile, digital style finances and the way that that's working? Mm-hmm. Within the 3 places that you found here, was there an age group or would there be a path to that, or what were your thoughts on that?
So when you say mobile digital, do you mean like mobile apps or?
Like with the banking, online banking, with their phones, they've got online apps with their phones for banking, deposits, they got snap deposits, all that type of stuff that you see coming in more and more and more.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I that wasn't really within the scope of the research that we looked at. We were really looking at more questions around what kind of a concept or construct is too complex for what age or developmental stage. But I think that's a really good question to look at, is what's the right place. This is not based on our research, but where I see in the field mobile apps being embedded the most is in the middle school or high school age range, because that's when they're starting to own their own mobile phones. But that was definitely not part of the research, and a good question.
I'm sorry. If I
Yeah.
could just dovetail off of that a little bit too. Some of the first signs that I've seen in my own kids is when they have their parents' devices or their older brothers and sisters' devices, and they're downloading apps or music or games. And they're navigating devices at a very young age, and it's almost amazing on how quickly they pick up on it, and that they know that they need a credit card or they need the iTunes password in order to get there, which is a pseudo, hey, I need to do this to transact. In my opinion, those are some of the very first things beyond the habits that you see. You go to the grocery store and you watch a cashier and something exchanges or a credit card gets swiped and you go out the door. I often wonder on how quickly, which I think evolves into the mobile banking type or the digital banking type of world, but I am always amazed on how young it is when someone can navigate a device.
Yeah, I wanted to echo a lot of what you said. I would suggest, if you think about the mobile device as a tool, financial tool, what our research shows is that the tools really have the most impact in the high school, in the 13 to 21-year-old area. So that would be the place that you may want to think about using those types of online tools to embed in the financial knowledge. But it's not if they don't get it at 13, life's over. They'll never get it, right? It's this ongoing reinforcement. And so what you're using the mobile devices for is to say, this is another way to do your banking. So you can go into the branch, you can do transactions through your mobile device, but you still have to make those same decisions about what is your balance, how are you saving, all of the things that you needed to learn in the executive functioning and in the habits and norms that it's a good thing to save. So those are how those things kind of go together. I think the paradigm shift for all of us that do financial education work is that it's not just the knowledge, it's not just the app, it's this kind of combination of interdependencies that really kind of help make a well-rounded child make financial decisions.
Steve, just
Again, I want to echo what everyone else has said regarding the progress in what you've been doing in this area. I think it's very beneficial. Kind of the takeaways that I see from this is that all of us as bankers can just apply this to our own office, our own shops back home, take it home with us, learn from it. I'm a grandfather, and take this home with our grandkids, also with our HR department and our training department to say, here's some tools that we can use with our employees that have children, to new hires that come on board, as well as using it with our trade organizations as well, saying this is something that we've learned, we've applied it in our own banks, this is something that we should try to do to help others. So great, thank you for these tools.
Julia.
Thank you. So along those same lines, are there sort of thoughts about how we can help you to do that? I think one of the things that I'm curious about is, given sort of this research, what opportunities might there be for this to be embedded or for this to be more disseminated to the networks that you all have and community banks represent?
My first thought is that what we have found, especially in schools, and parents and teachers are overwhelmed by the amount of information that we need to teach our children. So as bankers, as community members, it's up to us to assist them with this financial literacy, but it's still a matter of people understanding the importance of financial literacy as it relates to everything else that has to be taught on a daily basis. So I think, moving that financial literacy importance from down here to up here, I think is where we maybe struggle. So.
I think one of the other aspects of the distribution side of that is, so I have a list of 4 different programs that Sunrise Banks does, is some type of best practices, is taking this research. There are several different curriculums or multiple curriculums out there. Is there a way to get some consistency in there so that distribution can be cleaner, more consistent as kids progress? Julie, I know you're.
I'm concerned about the children who might fall through the cracks, the ones who might not go to the grocery store with their parents might not go to banks, or who have really bad habits that we don't want the upcoming youth to model. Because I think that there's probably quite a substantial population that fits into that description. And those are the ones I think we really need to concentrate on reaching so that they develop good habits from the beginning.
Yeah.
With respect to the libraries and schools in general, is there a means by which you're communicating directly with them other than it's on your website? I just took a peek at the website. You got to drill down a bit, and then when I got down, one of the guides, the one that was mentioned about the kid was rich on Sunday or something like that. It's unclear to me. Is that, I know there's a teaching guide. How does one get a hold of the book? But then, how are we reaching out to these? Are you? You want us to do that? I mean, we could do that. There's fewer and fewer community banks as we go forward. Hopefully that will stop, but I doubt it. But we can reach into our communities. But just looking at the priorities of our schools, we're feeding them, we're clothing them, and in many cases, we're parenting them. And we also have to educate them in the minimum skills. And this financial education piece has been pushed to wayside long ago. And I know we'd like to bring it back, but I think there's many other ills that have to be considered as well. And I think frankly, the best approach that I've seen is through a collaboration. Like we have in our schools, we have a theater program, and it's administered by a nonprofit. But it's funded by, in our state, New York, it's BOCES, which is a supplement to the school budget. And BOCES has determined that that's an important part of their education. So have we somehow rounded the troops there to say that this is an important part? Because I can tell you it's an important part, but I could talk to them blue in the face if we don't get the support of the educators.
Yeah.
So let me intervene on that. We think that it's very important that every state in the country prioritize this again. As you say, it's been pushed to the wayside in the school curriculum. And there's ways to inject it into the curriculum, and the research that they're doing provides lots of guidance on how that can be done. And ultimately, it's my own view, not everybody shares it, but it's my own view that ultimately we need some sort of standalone course at the high school level when people are being ready to be pushed out into the world to get that foundation at that time. But it's not so easy for us as a federal government agency to tell the states and the school districts what to do in this respect. They are much more likely to take leadership on this from you all, who are respected members of the community in those states, working through the legislature or the school districts to do this. And clearly, from what we're hearing today and what I've heard from others of you on other occasions, many of you are doing that. And that's I think it's just really important. I think we should all regard it as part of our patriotic duty to restore this back into a much more central position in people's education, because our young people are going to go out and they're going to need a lot of different skills, and they're going to have gotten a lot of different skills that may or may not be relevant in their lives. This is one that will clearly be relevant in their lives. It needs to happen. As for libraries, you asked about it, that's been a big project of ours. We do work directly. We have a lot of material on our website, but we work directly to recruit library systems across the country. I think at last count we have over 1,000 library systems across the country that are actively engaged with us, and we don't simply invite them to look at our website. We do webinars. We go out and meet with them. We are working with them so that they become hubs. Ultimately, what we'd like to see is that these various good partners of ours all work together on this. I mean, it may be in your community you would go to the library and try to recruit them into this process. Maybe in other areas, the libraries would go out to the community banks and say, we could use more programming at the library to reach people, the patrons who are coming in and out all the time, and you might work with them on that. But we have a lot of thoughts, but the libraries are a key partner because they are in every community across this country. They are trusted and respected. They're known as neutral providers of information. So that's been a real focus for us since early on. The other thing I would say to David's point, we want to sort of have some standard sense of approaches here, but we also want to leave a lot of flexibility. You mentioned a number of things that some of you do, and we hear them across the country. The Money Smart curriculum the FDIC does, it's a terrific curriculum. We don't need to reinvent the wheel on that. We promote that on our website, and they're promoting our materials on their website. In fact, Cassandra and I first met she was at the FDIC working on that, and neither one of us had any idea there was going to be a CFPB at that time, I think. It's a great program in multiple languages. The Junior Achievement Program, a number of you suggest, that's been around a long time. It has really proved itself. It is very popular among young people. My older brother, 50 years ago, 45 years ago, 40 years ago, was in that program in high school, and it still is going strong in Ohio today and in many places across the country. There are some specific programs we're aware of that a lot of community banks are operating with. They're very good. We're trying to add some foundation and some other tools and resources, and we just encourage you to try to get as much done in your communities as you can on this. You know how important it is. You're trying to make up for lost ground with many of your customers every day, and they would benefit greatly if we did more in this area. So,
thank you, Director. One more comment, and then we'll move on.
Sure. Question I have, after looking at the slides and the research and all the background work that you've done, we serve economically distressed neighborhoods, and I'm particularly interested in, for our youth that miss one or more of the three critical steps in their development, has the research matured to the point where you can start to quantify the impact of that in terms of where they are when they're 25 or 30 or 35 years old? Has the research got to that point yet where we can begin to put, I hate to say a dollar sign, but we can begin to measure what it means if you miss some of these critical steps in the process?
Yeah, my understanding is that the research has not gotten to that point, but I think there is a great deal of interest in sort of understanding, given this developmental model, how can you figure out where the individual's at? So I think that there's a lot of research that we need. I think in the executive function space, there is a great deal of resources that are out there that have already been developed that is available to financial educators that they can use. But I think in terms of like a assessment to see where someone's at, the research is not there. Yeah.
I think it's safe to say that the research you're hearing about today is really on the cutting edge of research in this area. And the interesting thing is it's sort of building on and trying to merge with developmental literature, child psychology literature, other educational literature, and tilt it more toward personal finance, consumer finance. And so that's why having these conversations and your thoughts about what directions the research might want to go are very helpful, because I do think that what we're talking about here today, there is no better research out there, and we're really trying to feel our way forward into areas that don't have plowed ground. So I think this is really formative work that is being done here, and it's being broadly distributed throughout the field to get feedback and input, and your input is part of that. So.
Well, with that, I think we're in vigorous agreement that we all want to help, and we're anxious for the next stage of research. So, Cassandra and Suenia, thank you very much, and thank you, council members, for that invigorating discussion. The second discussion of this afternoon, we will hear from Bureau staff about a set of recently released proposals that are under consideration by the Bureau. This summer, the Bureau released a set of proposals which would increase consumer protections as it pertains to third-party debt collectors and others covered by the Fair Debt Collections Practices Act, including many debt buyers. Debt collection is relevant to Community Bank's business, so we have invited the Bureau staff, Kristen McPartland, and senior counsel in the Office of Regulations, and John McNamara, acting Assistant Director in the Markets Office, to provide an overview of the Bureau's recent proposal and obtain council member input. John?
Great, thank you so much. We're glad to be here today. Am I close enough to the microphone? Is this working? All right, there we go. Thank you. I will provide a brief overview of the debt collection proposals under consideration, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague John to lead a discussion about them. And we'll try to get this going. There we go. So it may help to start by talking a little bit about the rulemaking process in general, as well as specific to the debt collection rulemaking we have underway now. Typically, rulemakings start with an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, an ANPR, and we did so in this case in November of 2013, where we asked about 162 questions covering a series of different topics, including consumer interactions with collectors and collector information in the collection process. We then move on to the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act process, and I'll speak a little bit more detail about that on the next slide. After that, we take the input we receive from the SBREFA process as we move into a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, where we incorporate the feedback and determine whether to go on with a NPRM, and if so, what to include in it. That's followed by a public notice and comment period. Then a final rule will be issued, and that typically has an implementation period, so an effective date sometime after the issuance of the final rule to allow companies to come into compliance with the new regulations. Now, on the SBREFA process, we start with an outline, which was issued on July 28th of this year. And that's a public-facing document that, in somewhat plain language, or as plain language as lawyers can get, will outline the goals of the Bureau as well as our thoughts on how to achieve those goals at this time. So it's an initial look at where we are in the rulemaking process, but it's not a proposed rule. And for those of you who have taken a look at the outline, it doesn't include draft regulatory text. Instead, it's designed to give the small entity representatives who are part of the SBREFA panel process an opportunity to see where the Bureau's thinking is at this time and provide advice and input on our proposals under consideration. So we do try to look at providing enough information for them to assess operationally how our proposals under consideration may affect them. That's then followed by a panel meeting, which in this case was held on August 25th, where we interact with and solicit that input from the small entity representatives. We also get written comments from them, and that's followed by the issuance of a report, which we prepare within 60 days, and assuming an NPRM is issued, the report is typically published with the NPRM. But we take all of this feedback as we move forward through the process, as we look at the proposals under consideration that we've outlined today and think about what to do as we move forward. So I'll move on to a few of the major topics, and again, there's going to be a great deal more detail in the outline itself, but we thought we would cover some of the highlights today for you, and then that'll lead into our discussion. The first topic is debt substantiation. Here, under the proposals under consideration, a debt collector would be required to possess a reasonable basis for claims of indebtedness throughout the debt collection lifecycle. And the Bureau is looking at specifically providing guidance at 3 points in time: before making initial claims, and in that case, a collector could obtain and review a list of fundamental information about the debt, could obtain a representation from the debt seller or owner about the integrity of the information, and could check the information they have received for what we call warning signs, or indications that the information may be implausible or incomplete or otherwise have problems with it. We also look at the time after the receipt of a consumer dispute. Of course, as you're aware, not all accounts in collection receive disputes, but some do. And after a dispute has been filed, we have outlined a series of documents that could be looked at specific to the type of dispute at issue to provide, again, that reasonable basis for making the claims about the debt in collection. Similarly, we've looked at what documents could be looked at before making claims in a litigation filing. Again, not all not all debts are going to go into litigation, but for those that do, this would provide guidance on what would constitute a reasonable basis for the claims. Oh, now we've gone too far. Our proposals under consideration also consider information transfer and forwarding requirements. This is aimed at improving the information that moves throughout the debt collection system. As we all know, debts themselves can have a certain life cycle. They may go out to a first collector, they may be returned back to a creditor or a debt owner, they may be sent out to another collector, and so on. So our proposals under consideration are looking at a requirement to pass on certain information when returning a debt to the debt owner or selling the debt to a subsequent debt buyer. The types of information that could be required include that which is related to the FDCPA, such as, for instance, dispute status, confirmed consumer contact status, which I'll talk about a little bit more when we get to communications, or inconvenient time, place, or manner information. It could also include other federal law information, such as interest rate limitations under the SCRA, or certain federal student loan discharge or rehabilitation information. And it could include other information, such as whether a consumer has communicated a language preference or has asserted a cease communication request. Similarly, we're also looking at information forwarding, which would apply after an account has been closed with a certain collector and returned. Because in some cases, we do know that collectors may get information about a debt even once that debt has left their possession. So they've returned it to the creditor or the debt owner, they've sent it on to another collector, and yet the consumer may still contact them or they may otherwise come into possession of information. This information could include payments submitted by the consumer, bankruptcy discharge notices, identity theft reports, disputes, or exempt income information. The second major topic that we looked at is consumer awareness. So that's consumer understanding of both the debt in collection itself as well as the process through which debts move when they are in collection. As most of you are probably aware, the FDCPA already requires a validation notice to be sent early in the communication process. It's often the very first communication, or it's within 5 days of making contact with the consumer. And here we're looking at requiring validation notices to include enhanced and clarified information, including more information about the debt, which could include the name of the creditor at the time of default, the name of the current creditor, the amount owed at default, the amount currently owed, and an itemization of interest, fees, and payments and credits since default. It would also look at including information about the consumer's rights, such as the right to dispute the debt. And we're looking at adding what we call a tear-off to the bottom of the letter, which would facilitate the consumer's exercise of their rights, with options such as this is not my debt or the amount is wrong that they could easily check and send back to the collector to begin that engagement. We're also looking at adding what we call a statement of rights, which would be a document with plain language explanations of certain consumer rights under federal law, such as the right to dispute a debt, the right to stop communications, the right to determine how and when those communications can occur, the right not to be harassed or abused, or to have one's privacy violated, such as through a third-party disclosure of the debt in collection. For both of these documents, we do intend to issue model documents that would satisfy the rule's content requirements, so a collector who used the model documents would know that they're in compliance. But the use of these would not be mandatory, so it would also be permissible if a collector wanted to use their own document as long as they did, in fact, meet the rule's requirements. Now, as part of the outline, we did go ahead and publish model disclosures. I will put them briefly on the screen because they are going to be somewhat too small to look at in detail here. They are in the outline, and although these are continuing to undergo consideration and testing, we felt it was important to put this out at this time so that people could see the type of information and the type of format that we're considering and provide us feedback on these documents. So in the outline, we have both the potential validation notice as well as the potential statement of rights. I think I have skipped ahead one again. There we go. I'll get this. There are a couple of other disclosures in the outline with the proposals under consideration that we're looking at, and those include a litigation disclosure as well as a time-barred debt disclosure. For the litigation disclosure, we're looking at collectors being required to provide in all communications in which they represent an intent to sue, a litigation disclosure informing the consumer that the collection agency intends to sue, that a court could rule against the consumer if he or she fails to defend the suit, and that additional information about litigation, as well as contacts for legal services programs, is available on the Bureau's website. So in other words, it would direct people to the CFPB's website. We're also looking at a time-barred debt disclosure, and here, collectors who are seeking to collect on time-barred debt could be required to disclose that the collector cannot sue to recover the debt. And we're also looking at possibly including a disclosure that if the debt is obsolete, which would be, generally speaking, that is too old to appear on most credit reports, or in other words, generally over 7 years in age. And these disclosures could appear along with the validation notice to inform consumers of the status of the debt, essentially that they cannot be sued for this debt due to its age. As part of this proposal, we're also looking at including a requirement that collectors who are collecting on time-barred debt be required to waive the right to sue on revived debt. Again, as many of you are probably familiar with, many states do allow for revival under certain circumstances. For instance, if someone affirms the debt in writing or if they make a partial payment. But this can be very difficult for consumers to understand, since it can look and feel to a consumer as if they are taking a positive step by engaging with the debt collector or making a partial payment. And it can therefore be very difficult to understand that, in fact, they are now possibly at risk of a lawsuit. So our time-barred debt disclosure looks at both the initial disclosure that the debt itself is time-barred, and then a waiver on the right to sue, even if it were revived. And again, consistent with this theory, that subsequent collectors would be prohibited from suing on a debt if an earlier collector had provided the disclosure. Again, as you can imagine, if a consumer receives a time-barred debt disclosure and is told they cannot be sued for the debt, a subsequent collector receives the debt and then makes a different determination, that could be very confusing and difficult for consumers. So we have a series of different disclosures that we are looking at right now. Although I do, as I mentioned before, want to reiterate that we continue to consider these, and we are also engaging in further consumer testing on them. Now, the third major topic is communication practices. And we'll go back again here. There's a number of different proposals outlined in the document, but I will touch on just a few of the high-level ones. The first is that the Bureau is looking at imposing a contact frequency limit on contacts and contact attempts. These would apply per week and per account, and it's split into two different categories. First is before the collector has confirmed consumer contact, and that limit would be 3 attempts per method of contact per week and 6 total attempts overall. So the way this would work is, for instance, if you have 2 phone numbers, a mailing address, and an email address, you could make up to 3 attempts per phone number, or per, I suppose if you wanted to send 3 pieces of mail in a week, you could do so, but subject to that 6 total overall cap. So in other words, it could be 2 phone calls to one phone line, 2 phone calls to another phone line, and then deciding how to use the last 2 attempts. Now, after the collector has confirmed consumer contact, and the concept with confirmed consumer contact is that the collector has reached the consumer who is the alleged debtor. So once the collector has that confirmed consumer contact, we're looking at a limit of 2 attempts per method of contact, again, per week, per account, and 3 total attempts, as well as 1 live conversation for the week. So these are the contact frequency limits that we're currently considering, and they go in part with our proposal under consideration about voicemail and other messages. Here, we're looking at saying that certain limited content voicemail and other messages for consumers would not communicate information about the debt or constitute FDCPA-defined communications, if they convey only 3 pieces of information: the individual debt collector's name, the consumer's name, and a toll-free method that the consumer can use to reply to the collector. So these limited content messages could be left in part as part of an attempt to contact the consumer. Again, there's more detail in the outline, but I also wanted to point out that we have a section in the outline on decedent debt. That is the collection of debts where the debtor at issue has passed away. There are a number of different proposals under consideration, but one in particular is that we're considering a waiting period after a consumer's death for communication about the collection of decedent debt. We're currently considering 30 days for that waiting period, although we're also soliciting comment on 60 days as a waiting period. Moving on to time, place, and manner. I'll get to the end of this before I get the hang of the clicker here. Time, place, and manner under the FDCPA has a series of statutory limitations, and here we're looking to provide some more clarity around those, as well as incorporate newer technology. So just as a few examples of the proposals under consideration that we're looking at, we are considering clarifying that whether communication is sent at an unusual or inconvenient time is determined by the time the communication generally is available for receipt by the consumer. So again, as an example, if I send an email at 11 a.m., that would be the time that the communication is considered to be sent, even if the consumer doesn't actually open it until 11 p.m. We're also looking at providing some additional guidance around presumptively inconvenient places, which would include a presumption that medical facilities, places of worship, places of burial or grieving, and child care facilities are presumptively inconvenient for debt collection communications. And again, going back to the topic of email, we're looking at prohibiting collectors from using an email address that they know or should know is the consumer's workplace email for debt collection communications, unless the consumer has consented directly to the debt collector. I'm sure we're all familiar with logging into your computer screen at work and it says nothing on the system is private, so we have a concern about the privacy of email messages to consumers in that context. Finally, we discuss consumer consent in communications. Here we're looking at clarifying some of the parameters of obtaining consent from consumers for communications that would otherwise be restricted by the FDCPA. Though some of the aspects of consent could be direct consent, that would be obtained directly from a consumer by the collector, whether orally or in writing. Disclosure, which would be a requirement to clearly disclose to the consumer, orally or in writing, what the consumer is consenting to. And memorialization, the requirement to memorialize that consent, and in writing, that could be preserving the written consent in the account file. For oral consent, it could include a recording or a notation in the account file. Just a couple more proposals I wanted to touch on briefly. One would be a prohibition on sale or placement. When against placing or selling debt to someone who is subject to a judgment or order that prohibits them from collecting debt in the state in which the consumer resides. Another would be prohibiting that sale or placement of debt with unlicensed collectors. Now, of course, not all states have licensing regimes, but some do, and so it would apply in that context. And finally, looking at a record-keeping requirement. This could be a requirement that records must be kept documenting the actions the collector took with respect to the debt. Could be required to retain these records for 3 years. And for recording calls, collectors would not be required to record their calls, but if they did so, a requirement to keep those recordings. Just one last note before I pass this over to John. We have been engaging in quite a bit of debt collection-related research through our Office of Research. That includes, as I mentioned earlier, testing model disclosures. That's cognitive and usability testing to make sure that consumers both understand and can interact with the disclosures that we're considering. And that work is ongoing. We've also been engaging in a consumer survey to learn about consumers' experience with debt and debt collectors. We published preliminary results of that survey as part of the outline in Appendix B, and full results will be coming out later this year. And we've engaged in a collector operations survey, the results of which were published in July along with the outline, and looked at various practices currently in the market. as well as to help us assess the possible impacts of these proposals under consideration. I realize that's a very high-level view of a lot of topics. I do encourage everyone to take a look at the outline, but in the meantime, I hope it provides some background to lead into this discussion.
Thank you, Kristen. At this point, we would like to hear from you, some feedback from you, the community bankers, and we've got a number of questions that we'd like to pose to you and hear what you think. The first one is, what type of information do consumers need to know about their debts, to know about the debt collection process, and to know about their rights in dealing with debt collectors?
Go ahead, Cal.
Yeah, I think one thing that'd be helpful in looking at the model disclosure you had, I couldn't tell if it was an email or a web link there. But I think it'd be very helpful for consumers to be able to have some sort of web link where they could go and get more information, maybe see some FAQs, even sample dispute letters so they could dispute a debt, and a little bit more about what their rights are versus trying to put it all on the notice of disclosure on the front end.
Okay, great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? And I'd probably echo that from the standpoint of keeping things as simple as possible, but just that awareness of where do I go to get the information I need. It's easy to say, I think, that at the beginning of the loan, you put a disclosure or something else, and we know those stacks of documents continue to grow and they continue to confuse, we think, the consumer in that particular instance. But if there is an awareness as to where to go to get that information, I think that clean, simple access would be good.
Great, thank you, David.
We're very glad to hear that, because the Statement of Rights does currently envision having the website for the CFPB at the bottom of it.
Okay.
And we would hope that that would help to increase consumers' access to tools.
Thank you. So the next question is, if you place accounts with a third-party debt collector, currently what sorts of information or what type of information do you provide them at time of placement?
We don't place them with a third-party collector. We do everything as a first party, so on my side of it, that's what I know.
Does anybody place
Does
debt with a
anybody
third
place
party?
third party?
Sam?
Generally speaking, we would give them the contents of the loan file. We would give them any correspondence that we might have. In most cases, they'd be charged off deposit accounts. We place those. We generally collect our loan files individually unless they take legal action like foreclosure or something of that nature, which is required by law, so we can't do those. But to the extent that we do, it would be in cases we would prove the debt, show the owner of the debt, information about them, and any correspondence.
Great, thank you. Is it fair to, excuse me.
I'd just like to go back to that notice of the rights. If we provided a notice of their rights on collections and their rights as to their debts at the time the loan was closed, and also had them sign agreements that if they become delinquent, we have the right to turn over their private information to a third-party collector, because that's my concern of ever hiring someone else to collect my debt, is I'm giving them private information of a consumer and their debt obligation to just somebody out on the street. I'd need their permission first to be able to do that and do it comfortably. So I need something signed by them at loan closing to give me permission when I tell them about their rights if they go delinquent.
Thank you. It's my sense that most of the council members present don't turn accounts over to third-party debt collectors. Is that fair?
I think that's fair to say. Go ahead.
We do some credit card accounts that we turn over to a third party, but we provide a full electronic file to them when they do that. So.
Okay, great.
One of the questions I would have as you embark on potential rulemaking, I'm very sympathetic for the consumer in this situation, because what typically happens is that the debt is placed with one debt buyer, who then places it with another debt buyer, who then places it, and a daisy chain of events sort of takes place at that point. And it seems as though the quality of the information then gets more and more diluted as it continues to go down that chain. how are you thinking about that problem? Because I keep thinking about if you're at the fourth collection firm on the same credit card debt, and you have a question about or substantiating the debt, that has to then go all the way back upstream, it would seem. And it's very challenging and I'm sure incredibly confusing for consumers. What are the obligations for the creditor and the collection agency in those situations? It's not an easy answer, I understand, but it does seem to be a big hurdle in the process, because most of the time they've never heard of these companies before. They're thinking, I have this credit card with this place, why is this place calling me instead?
I think it's a great point, and as you could tell from Kristen's presentation, the access to and the flow of information is a very big concern in this rulemaking. Certainly, on our complaint database, complaints from the consumer about continued attempts to collect a debt that's not owed is the single greatest area of complaints. And we've done a lot of research in this area. As a matter of fact, in 2013, we held a joint roundtable with the Federal Trade Commission specifically about data integrity in the debt collection context.
And John, just a question on that.
Go ahead.
Just a question on the confusion. Is that coming with debt that is sold, or is it being collected by a third party? I mean, ours is different. We retain ownership. We aren't selling the debt. So I see the confusion where Trent was talking about earlier for those debts that are sold and subsequently sold and sold again multiple times. And I don't think that's as prevalent as it once was, but maybe it's coming back again. I don't know.
Right. In this framework, there wouldn't be a different standard for contingency accounts or accounts placed with a third-party collector or debt sales. They would both be expected to have the same level of information.
We do assign a small number of our debts to a third party, and our understanding of the privacy rules is that we're permitted to share that information, and also our contract allows us to share it.
Very good. Menso?
I work with families that, frankly, can't afford the debt that they're in, but and when I look at their credit report, a lot of the credit report information is horribly scant. Does the CFPB have authority over Experian, TransUnion, whatever, or whoever reports to those individuals, so that they have to provide a lot more detail? I mean, we don't have account numbers, phone numbers are wrong. It just says collection or medical, and that doesn't help me at all. Help the customer.
Yeah, that's a very big issue, and it's one that before the CFPB, there was very little oversight of the credit reporting companies. There was occasional enforcement action by the Federal Trade Commission or maybe state attorneys general. There's some private liability for violations of different credit reporting laws, but for the most part, they were sort of a world unto themselves. We have been undertaking, it's a very big project to establish a supervision program over an industry that has not been supervised before, and over companies, some of them quite large, the three in particular, but also, FICO and other companies in that sphere, and other specialty credit reporting companies that are not used to dealing with compliance in this way. And I could tell you a story, it's too long to tell here, that would show you just how rudimentary the compliance mentality was at these companies before we came along. It's been a multi-year project to sort of bring them into the fold in terms of what is needed for compliance. We have enforcement authority and supervisory authority over them. There are intersections between debt collection and credit reporting, because debt collectors have found that it's often a useful collection tool to report or threaten to report on your credit report, or to simply not threaten, just passively put it on there and then wait for you to find that you have a problem, and then that will cause you to potentially clean it up by paying it. So it's somewhat complicated in terms of how they intersect, but yes, we do have authority over this. It's a new authority. It's very important that that industry turn its attention toward its obligations to consumers, because up to now it's been mostly a business-to-business industry. They buy or obtain information, they assemble it, and then they sell to companies that want to have that information for assessing creditworthiness. And although it is our individual consumer information, there hasn't been enough attention to that aspect of things and obligations under the law that exist, and perhaps laws that need to be changed and updated as well. It's a good question.
Keep going, you're good?
I was just going to echo on that, what Menzo was saying here and stuff as far as the challenges for consumers, and maybe something for the debt collectors is there should be a point where that they can contact whoever it is reporting onto the bureaus, and if they get one of them removed, they should be removing the other two, because we find that a lot too. They've contacted one, then they just bring it on to a different bureau. So I think the contact information would be good. It would be a good thing to have for the consumer. And then also, if you have one removed, you should be required to remove it from the other two. You shouldn't have to go back and ask them for another month to remove this other one as well.
John, we have about 10 minutes if questioning, but go
Just
ahead,
one
Dion,
more.
please.
I mean, I'm new this year, so I'm not going to apologize. I'm just going to explain. When my head's wrapped around something, I have to speak up. This privacy issue, going back to that, if it's on the back of the contract that they give you the right to just give their information out about their delinquency, then why are we even talking about this and not emailing and not leaving your card and not putting your name on the envelope and hiding the fact they're delinquent if they gave us the right to share it? So there is a privacy issue here. You wouldn't be worried about all this, right?
Well, I think part of the privacy issue, as I understand it, is that it'll be what you've disclosed on your privacy disclosure, whether you share with third parties or not.
I thought it was on the back of the contract, they said.
But I think ultimately that the main document that you're going to look at from a compliance standpoint is what you've disclosed when that account was opened and when you gave them a privacy notice. And in there, it'll describe who you share information with. Now, if that's changed, then you have to reissue a privacy notice. That may also be reinforced within the contract of the debt somewhere, or you may have a customer who signs off specifically in a contractual way. There might have to be some consideration for that, maybe not. I'm not an attorney in that case.
Right.
But
if the
that
back-
privacy, your privacy policy is in that publication.
Well, I understand that, but
is gonna be
someone
the key
said
document.
earlier, the back of the loan itself, the contract gives you the right to hire a third party and give them that information. My privacy notice doesn't say I share your delinquency status, and I don't. But if someone's down there said that it's on the back of my loan document, then I can send them an email and talk about it. And someone said earlier the emails are kept forever, so we got to protect their privacy. But if they're correct in the fact they gave that up when they signed the back of my loan document, so I just y'all are confusing me there.
I would just say to you that if you retain the debt and contract with a third party to collect it, they're an agent of the bank. So in essence, you're not sharing that information. You're hiring somebody to do a job.
It may also help to just remind everyone that the proposals under consideration apply to debt collectors under the FDCPA, and the FDCPA itself has a provision prohibiting the disclosure of a debt to a third party. So some of what we're talking about in terms of privacy here involves protecting people from having that existence of the debt and collection disclosed without their consent to other people. I think there's a little bit of two things going on here.
Thank you, Kristen. The next question, for those of you who do engage the services of third-party debt collectors, at what point of delinquency do you turn those accounts over?
Gentlemen, I'll look your way.
At our shop, typically it's been charged off, and we're going to attempt to collect them in-house probably for upwards of 180 days before we would turn them over.
So 180 days after charge-off?
After charge-off.
Okay.
Because we're going to attempt to collect it ourselves and work something out with the customer prior to turning it to a collection agency,
So on a credit card, almost a year after delinquency?
basically.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
No.
If you use a third party, a party other than your community bank, do they operate in the name of their own name as a debt collector, or do they use the name of the bank?
I'd have to ask my compliance people. I don't know, to be honest.
In our case, it's the former. They use their own name.
So if it's Ajax Collections, they would represent themselves as Ajax
Right.
Collections, collecting on behalf of your bank.
Right.
Okay,
And
thank you.
in our particular case, we actually use attorneys who specialize in collection. So they act as their own and say they're collecting on our behalf. But we would not go to someone outside of that category. We strictly deal with lawyers who specialize in collections.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, my only comment would be, it would be very unnerving in the debt collection industry to let them represent themselves to a customer as though they were the bank. That just inherently seems very unnerving to me.
My sense is that a lot of you don't sell debt or maybe don't engage in third-party collection because you're worried about what that would mean for the relationship that you try to maintain between yourself and the customer. Now, obviously, if people owing you debt over a long period of time, they're not your best customers, but you're always trying to rehabilitate them, I'm sure, and improve the relationship. So this is interesting. I think John was getting at, the practices are mixed around the country of whether people want someone to collect in their name or because then it's more recognizable, or whether they really prefer that they collect in their own name. They're still agents if you're contracting with them, but I'm sure that feels differently to different businesses at different times.
Thank you. And then my last question probably may apply to all of you, and that is, if you've got any unique tools that you provide your customers to help prevent default, would you mind sharing? Tools, tactics, or strategies to help your customers avoid going to default?
I meet with them personally. I make them bring in 2 years' tax returns. I make them bring in a pay stub, most recent. Then I provide them with a budget worksheet, which now I'm going to steal from CFPB. It's a little easier to use.
Good.
And then they have to sit down with me personally if they want any help. So I'm starting to pick up quite a client list, but that's what I do. But I don't care if it's our debt or someone else's. I'll meet with any consumer within my market. I'll qualify that because I don't want your customers to call me. But that's what we do, and it's a commitment that I've made personally, and we've carried that through with the bank for some years.
Thank you.
Say any consumer or any customer?
Any customer, any consumer, business.
Doesn't even have to be
person.
existing. Actually, got it.
Right. Yeah.
And we're very quick to modify and restructure agreements when we can see that a customer is having trouble. We'd rather have them perform under a modified agreement than have them default. And I mean, even if it requires effort on our part, but it's better than the alternative.
That to me is one of the hallmarks I've seen among community banks. We've seen it in mortgage servicing as well. We do well if the banking system more generally reflected that same attitude across the board, and other financial companies as well.
We do very similar situation. We try to work with the person, whether it's medical needs, medical issues, extend the term. We had a situation where an elderly woman and her son were living in a home, and we had to foreclose on the property, but we let them stay in the property. And we asked maybe if they may pay a small amount of rent, but no, that didn't work. And we just kept them in there and worked with social services because there was a need there as well. So just did that. Pardon me? We actually took the property back in our name and kept it there, but yet had to deal with, those are the types of things you just do.
That's the good thing about community bankers. We do care. Our bank offers one time a year a free extension, so they can take it any time during the year without a charge. And a lot of people use that when they're buying school clothes, or if they have a situation and a problem, they take advantage of the one-time free without a charge extension, because everybody has life problems that hit you. But if someone gets in a problem, we sit down and work with them, and if they have a legitimate, hardship that they have, we don't want their stuff, and we don't want to be mean to them. We want them to pay us, and we want to help them. That's what we do. So we try to reschedule payments, lower them, give them a 3-month deferment, do whatever they need so they can get back on their feet. And we do that with any type of loan that we can, at my bank anyway.
Just as a comment to that, and maybe a little bit of balance, I'll tell you what we do, and then kind of take off on that. Part of it is setting expectations when the loan is made, that, and we're fairly clear that of what the due date is and what will happen 10 days after. So it's our practice that if someone goes 10 days delinquent, even as they get to 9, if you will, we're going to call them. And it's usually the person who made the loan is going to call them. And so it's not distant. It's certainly more personal because that loan officer was generally there at the time of closing. So the expectations are there. And that seems to work pretty well. And it in some cases avoids the confusion of, well, I have a grace period of 30 days, don't I? Well, no, this is the loan that we have with you is not a credit card. It doesn't have that. We're going to give you a call come 10 days. And if something's wrong, we want to know and we'll work with you. There is, I think, a balance kind of going to the discretion that a community bank has in a more of a default situation, and then the risk rating and ultimately the charging off of that loan. Our prudential regulators are going to have certain standards as to when that loan has to be charged off or risk rated differently, and certain capital requirements or reserve requirements will come into place. So there is behind the scenes cost, and I think it is in most cases the community bank's desire to work with the customer and find the solution that is good for both. And they do that at a cost. And so that's just kind of the balance in the game that we play. And as we had mentioned, you know, it's only cash that repays the loan. It's not the house. It's not the car. You have to convert those items into cash. And so it's generally better that the consumer has access to those, can get to work, and we can figure out something from there.
We had major floods in Grand Forks and in Minot where people lost their homes, or they had to leave their homes, I should say, for months. And we just called every customer and said, don't worry about your payment. Find your home, take care of your family. We'll take care of the credit rating. We'll take care of all that, and we'll just work through it. And that's the way you do it. And we let our regulator know this is what was happening, this is what was going on, and that's just part of being a community bank. You live with these people on a day-to-day basis. You see them every day.
Trent, we'll give you the last word.
I'm not sure that's a great idea. No. I do think also an area of great concern for me is at various stages of delinquency, it is a negotiation. That's the reality. And I'm aware of circumstances where the willingness, just like buying a car, and I know that's of great interest to the Bureau, the collector has a great deal of latitude, and the degree to which they exercise that latitude for some borrowers but not others is really concerning, particularly as we think about protected classes and the willingness to negotiate 50 cents on the dollar versus 75 cents on the dollar. And I think that it's ripe for disparate treatment, frankly.
Good point. Well, very good. Well, committee members, thank you very much for a very good discussion. Kristen and John, thank you for your presentation. We'll look forward to more to come, and thank you for making some sense out of the complexity of the debt collection world. That concludes our meeting of the CFPB's Community Bank Advisory Council. Thank you again for your time, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.